Welcome everyone. I hope you enjoyed the show for the moment and the 2 days of the Respond program. I'm Sabine Flechet. I'm the Vice President of French Tech Munich, and I have the pleasure of moderating this session in cooperation with BMW Foundation, Unternehmertum, and of course, French Tech Munich. I'm very pleased to welcome 4 great minds and insightful guest speakers for our panel discussion today to talk about impact and the place of impact in Europe in building impact companies. So first, let's maybe do a round of introductions, and I'm going to go through my own view of the speakers, starting with Marie Kameyama. You are an investment officer at Investir Plus, a French pioneer VC fund focusing on impact and based in Paris. You invest in high potential startups in France and in Spain, and you support their growth by providing them not only with funding, but also go-to-market expertise and extended network with a focus on impact. Can you tell us a little bit more about you?
Yes, of course. Nice to meet you. Thanks for the invite. It's been like 3.5 years that I've been working at Investir Plus, so investing more and more in English. What's very important to say for Investir Plus is that we are an entrepreneur fund, meaning that all our investors are entrepreneurs. We don't have any institutional LPs. And so these people, these entrepreneurs help us to support very operationally and also strategically our entrepreneurs, impact entrepreneurs. We are an impact first fund, which means that that's the most important criteria that we have to choose the project that we invest in. And so it's kind of a big community of entrepreneurs, investors that are themselves entrepreneurs that help each other to create more impact. And everybody is very aligned around this will to generate impact. Maybe just to give an example of the kind of project that we can support. Very recently, we have invested in a nice project that is called LifeEase. Mm-hmm. It's a company that creates AED, so defibrillator, for the B2C market, because the founder realized that a lot of heart strokes occurred at home, but there's no AED for the B2C market. And his will is to, and what set us was his will to save life. So that's the kind of project we like to support, and the entrepreneurs we want to help.
Yeah, super great, very insightful, and a very great vision. And I guess you're also very operational, which we'll come to talk a bit in a minute. Then next, our second investor, also a woman. So I'm very pleased that we have a very balanced panel today. Lauren Lentz, you an American transplanted in Germany. So we also have a very good representation of nationalities here. You started your career at McKinsey. You spent the early part as a social scientist, and then moved to VC and did the jump to co-found Revent together with Otto Birnbaum. And Revent is also an impact fund, and you focus on solutions that help solve hard problems both for society and for the planet. So can you tell us a little bit more about you and Revent?
Yeah, sure. And again, thanks a lot for the invitation to be here. I have to say, years ago, I wouldn't have imagined as an American sitting on a panel with a bunch of French people in Germany at Respond Days. So this is really fun. So maybe just a couple of words about Revent. And we would call ourselves really an impact-focused VC, but very much see ourselves as a venture capital fund, which means that we have kind of 2 focuses at the same time. So on one hand, we're looking for scalable tech solutions to hard problems where we see real commercial potential, growth potential, and financial upside. On the other hand, it's equally important to us that there is inherent impact in the product or service, in the business model, and where we think that the founders are purpose-driven, intrinsically motivated, and really out there to tackle a hard problem. And as you said, we have this dual focus of people and planet. So broadly, climate tech, health and well-being, and this category called empowerment. And we invest early, so pre-seed and seed primarily, with a European, or let's say geographic Europe-wide focus, which includes the UK. And we started Revent because we thought that it was important to have a home also in Germany. There are kind of many homes in other ecosystems for this next generation of founders who have the aspiration to build a big company, but a big company that's really going after a problem with significant importance to our planet and to our society. So the fund is now just over a year old, and we've made the first 8 investments and are very happy to be here today at Respond.
Thank you, Lauren. And we'll see how impact has become kind of I don't want to say a buzzword, but sometimes can be also used in different manners and with different definitions. Last but not least, we have also 2 startups with us and 2 French startups. I'm going to start with Alexis Normand, who is the CEO and co-founder of Greenly. Greenly is a company that automates carbon footprint tracking for individuals and SMEs, and it's also certified by what we call the Green Tech 20, which is a French tech label that enlists and select the best top-notch social and environmental friendly startups. We'll come back to this in the panel. Previously, Alexis, you were also a part of the company Withings at the Boston office, taking care of the connected healthcare and driving adoption of IoT among hospitals and pharma. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and what Greenly does?
Well, thank you, Sabine. I think you said it all, but essentially, having spent a couple of years seeing how automating dashboard creation could change behavior in healthcare, it occurred to my co-founders and myself that we needed to build similar tools to address what I would call the tragedy of horizons for climate change. It's super hard to act right now to tackle an issue which you don't face the consequences of immediately. And of course, the right way to look at this is to reward your efforts and generate tracking. So essentially, we built a dashboard targeted at SMEs so that they could monitor their carbon footprint, knowing that what's out there mostly today is consulting, and it's very well done, but it's too expensive and it's too time-consuming for most companies. And the result of this, essentially, is that only about 40% of GHG emissions are managed today. And yet we have to reduce our emissions by 50% by 2030. So essentially, we're building a tool to scale this GHG tracking to SMEs. We'd like to be, I suppose, the QuickBooks of carbon accounting. So we have about 150 customers today, and we're working on, getting to 1,000 and so on and so forth.
Great vision, and I think this is also needed if we want to change habits. A way of monitoring these habits should also be in place. Last but not least, our second French startups, also part of the Green Tech 20. Tanguy Detroz is Deputy CEO of Metron. What does Metron develop? IT solutions based upon AI to reduce the carbon footprint for this time major industrial customers, large buildings and retailers, as well as public institutions. And Metron is also already in 10 offices worldwide, so a bit later stage and a bit more international. Tanguy, can you tell us a little bit more about you and Metron?
Yeah, so Metron was started, as you said, a bit earlier than Greenly. We started already in 2013, and we now have offices on 4 different continents with customers in those countries. More than 120 large customers are using our solutions today. The main reason for starting Metron was to think that if we want to have a real impact on the energy consumption, then we will need to have AI tools helping the people to take the right decision, because there's so many items that come into the decision process that you need analytical tool to help you to do that and to get the right insights. From my background, I have an engineering degree. I started a company focusing on the development of energy monitoring solutions as soon as in 2002, so just 20 years ago. And I recently joined Metron as Deputy CEO in charge of territories.
Great, thank you very much. And thanks a lot for joining our panel. And thanks to our audience watching also this panel. So let's get right into the subject. We want to talk about impact in Europe and how to build impact companies, how to scale impact in Europe. But first, maybe just to give a little bit of context to our audience, let's define impact, because we've been hearing, and I guess the COVID pandemic has also kind of fostered that situation. We've heard a lot of different words. We've learned impact, ESG, SDG, tech for good, green tech. You know, there is a little bit of a mismatch or a little bit of a confusions in the head of people. So maybe first to my two investors, when you look at impact in your own investment firm, what strikes out? What do you define as impact in your investment thesis? Maybe Marie or Lauren, who wants to start?
Yes, that's not an easy question to answer, because I guess there's no one definition of what impact is, even in France, and I guess it is the same in Europe. But what we try to do at Investir Plus is just to ask ourselves some questions. The first one is, what's the problem, and what's the size of the problem that the entrepreneur have decided to answer with, to solve with its solution. So that's the first question. Is the issue significant, and is it a real social or environmental problem? So that's the first thing we ask. Then is the solution very efficient or not? And does it tackle like the root cause of the problem? Because we guess the purpose of the impact project is that their core business solve a problem. So we need that to be like big problem with a good solution that is very efficient. And maybe the most important is the intentionality of the entrepreneurs, of the founders, like why they do that, why they have decided to tackle this issue. And we are convinced that if there's not that strong will of the entrepreneurs to solve the problem, this is not impact. And you can make impact because, like by default, or because there's a market opportunity, which is a good thing. But for us, real impact projects are impact that are very willing to change the world positively. So and the last thing is maybe like how we can help them. And we think that the role of an impact fund is to be able to really help the project. Like that's what we call the additionality of what we do. And this is also an important criteria to define what is an impact project is, and what an impact fund has to do to be a real impact fund.
Okay, so basically, if I summarize, size of the market, efficiency of the solution, intentionality of the founder, he's long-term committed to this, and additionality, which is basically what the value adds that you can bring to the
and
table.
There's no grids or scale or whatever, like it's a lot of common sense and qualitative analysis, but no grids, no scale, because like it's not easy to summarize impact and very different impact into grids or scale or whatever.
Lauren, what do you think as more of a kind of balanced impact financial VC?
I mean, so maybe just as a starting point, the very broad way we think about impact is that there needs to be the intent, so intentionality of delivering a significant, positive, measurable improvement for the planet or for society. And if we don't see that intent, and if we don't have conviction that the solution is going to move the needle in a significant way, this is already out of scope for us. And so when we think about what we try to avoid, it's investments in non-purpose-driven founders. So when there's not really intentionality, but maybe more opportunism, which is maybe fine for other investors, but not for us, as well as marginal improvements. So we have to have conviction that the sort of extent of the change, so not just the breadth or the scale, but also the depth or how much you've moved the needle, is also significant in terms of outcomes, efficiency, cost reduction, in sort of expansion of access. And then I think somewhat similarly, we look at a couple of different dimensions. There was something called the Impact Management Project, which maybe some audience members and panelists have heard, which tries to break down impact into kind of very basic dimensions, the who, the what, forces you to think through kind of what change is happening for whom, driven by what, to what extent, what would have otherwise happened. So this question of what's the counterfactual. And this all is incorporated into our analysis. And maybe just as a final note, the way that we try to make this concrete and the way that we try to make this then somewhat equivalent to how we think about financial performance or potential financial performance is that we also have at the fund level overall impact goals related to the portfolio level aversion of greenhouse gases and the portfolio level impact on individuals. And so we have to have conviction that each company that we invest in could be, quote unquote, an impact fund returner in its respective domain, just as we would have to have conviction on the financial side that each investment could be similarly a fund returner in financial performance. And so as much as possible, we try to take something of a sort of investor lens with this portfolio approach to impact as well as to financial performance, so that these are not viewed as being kind of two very separate categories looked at with extremely separate tools, but rather we try to integrate this as much as possible.
Interesting. So that basically you're also trying to adapt the financial returns and the KPI that you would look as a normal VC into impact returns and KPIs that you can measure throughout the life cycle of your investments. Great. So let's move on the other side and look maybe at the perspective of the entrepreneurs, Tanguy and Alexis. You both, or both of your startups are part of the Green 20 initiative from the French Tech 120 and Next 40. What does that exactly mean? Like, what's this kind of focus on green tech? And do you agree with Marie and Lauren on their definition of impact, or now green tech, since we are under this label? Who wants to start first?
I'll go if Tanguy allows me. Thank you. So I can only agree. What I would say, though, is our definition is a bit narrower, given our own specific purpose. Of course, it can be, many different things along the sustainable development goals and so on. But in our particular case, our focus is essentially climate change. So we try as much as possible to reduce the definition of impact to things that are quantifiable. Obviously, it's greenhouse gas emissions, which are mostly expressed in kilograms of CO2 equivalent, which is really an aggregate of all the different GHG emissions into a single unit. And of course, the absolute level is interesting, but what's even more interesting, right, is the trajectory. And the thing is, there is a global trajectory that has been laid out for essentially the planet, right, to reduce global warming. But what's very interesting for us is to cascade or trickle down these objectives down to every company. So, there are objectives, there are standards for this. There's one particular, so there's a pathway in general, but it's broken down by sector. So there's one initiative that you may have heard of, which is the Science-Based Target Initiatives, which essentially lays out a reduction path of 7-8% in average for every company. But of course, that curve is different for every company. For an SME, it's typically 4 or 5% reduction a year. And because we quantify this based on essentially each department of a company, we break down this objective by scope, by function in the company, and so on and so forth. So it's making this as quantifiable as possible, and also linking this to financial accounting, with the idea that both in a way need to merge. So we have a narrow definition. We're asked all the time whether we should add water, land usage, and so on. We're strictly carbon focused. And at the end of the day, we are certifying not simply a global level, but really a trajectory. And I think when we will have done this right, this can serve as something with a little more constraint, I think, for companies across the globe. We just need to prove now that every SME can do it. But impact has very strong ties to obviously regulations. And once you create the data, I've seen it before in healthcare, you can create new types of incentives for companies. They can start making essentially getting paid for their efforts, so you need to tie the CO2 to money, not so much in the sense of investment, but in the sense of cashing in on the positive externalities that you create for the planet.
Yeah, anyway. And I guess this kind of draw back to what Loven was saying in terms of trying to bring financial accounting for the financial returns of the fund with kind of impact accounting.
Right, but we do this at a very microeconomic level, essentially. Yeah. So what is your green premium? How much more does it cost for you to transition? And are you earning money for your efforts? And I think you can really quantify for every kilogram of CO2 in every department how much more it's going to cost you to emit less, or how much you're going to save. And so we really tie both notions.
Yeah, and I guess you're a great tool as well for VC who wants to measure this in their portfolio companies, because I think carbon footprint is one of the KPI that impact funds are.
So for sure, we look for distributors, right? We sell this to SMEs directly, but we're now working with 6 investment funds, mostly private equity firms, which have an obligation to start reporting their CO2 emissions for every company in their portfolio. And once we are able to demonstrate that we have essentially a cheaper and faster solution than what they were doing before, well, it's easier to have your pro rata of emissions for every company. So yes.
Oh, very, very, very interesting. Thanks. We'll come back to this. Tanguy, what is Metron doing about impact? Do you also have similar KPIs measurement, and do you help also maybe larger corporates, larger conglomerates to measure their impact?
Well, I would like to get back to what Mary and Lauren said previously, because they both mentioned either passion or conviction. And I think it's important for the audience to remember that today, and probably more than ever, we have we see financial capabilities to support convictions rather than a business plan. And I think in the current situation where we see what happened during last summer in Germany and in Belgium and in different countries with the floods and with the heat in Canada, we have no time to waste any longer for climate change. We need to be active, and we need to do something. And if you want to do it at a global scale and to really have an impact, that's at least our conviction of the CEO and myself at Metron, is that we wanted to help the biggest CO2 emitters to do something and to be aware of what they do and to help them reduce that as much as we can. So we are focusing on big companies. You mentioned that big companies or big players, let's say, because we also work for the public sector. We have hundreds of communes and cities that are working with our tools today. The idea for us was to have really from the very beginning a global role, a global footprint. So that's the reason why Metron started subsidiaries in Japan, in South Korea, in Latin America. We have 3 subsidiaries already today. We are opening North America. We have an office in Canada. So from day one, we said the Metron must be a global company, and we must support our customers wherever they are. And if they go to the moon, we will be on the moon as well. So the idea is really to help them with tools that make them more efficient, because what we see is that efficiency is key in these topics. And I fully support the Green Initiative. I had the pleasure to meet Alexis a couple of days ago. What we do is we have different targets, and I'm very pleased to see that while we focus on big players having energy invoices in the order of magnitude of tens of millions of euro, we also see players coming for the minor field, let's say, or the smaller players but which are much more numerous than the big companies. But altogether, I think, well, we are on the right track, hopefully.
Hopefully, and this brings me to my next question. So Metron is already quite global, and you want to make impact a global standard. How do we bring this back to Europe, which is a very fragmented market where, definitions are probably not aligned, there's a lot of buzz, and we don't have any standards, right? So there's no financial accounting the same way for impact, where we could say, okay, these are the KPIs that we want to measure. So we heard a little bit about how Metron is doing this on a global scale, how Greenly is doing this more down into the SMEs and trying to bring standards. But if everyone is doing this at the end, how do we harmonize this? Maybe whoever wants to take that point, how do we bring impact at scale in Europe and in an harmonized environment?
From my side, I would say that there are two ways of looking at this problem. The first way is do your best effort and do not try to measure it, or do not spend too much time in measuring it. If you make your best effort and you reduce your CO2 emissions and energy consumption, of course there will be a positive impact on the planet. Whether we need to make specific KPIs on that and whether those KPIs have to be the same in the different regions, that's more a political issue. And that political issue, we all know as industrial that it will take some time before it's done. In Europe, we are the world champion to create regulations and to create rules. I think at this stage, we don't have the time to wait for a way to have standardized KPIs all over the planet. When I see how many different labels you have for a green building, whether it's a BREEAM, an HQE in France, NetZeb, whatever the significance of those labels, but we need to act first of all. Looking at the KPI
needs to come more from the companies, the individual levels, the entrepreneurs, versus wait for the government.
Yeah, definitely.
If I may add, of course, that's the $100 million question, right? How do you scale across Europe, across the continent? Well, first of all, it's extremely important to scale because France is 1% of global emissions. If you take the 6 top countries in Europe, it's 10% of global emissions. So whatever effort you do to reduce your emissions won't have much impact if it doesn't have impact in India or China. It's a global problem. So innovation has to scale, otherwise it's useless, basically, at least on climate change. So the question is extremely important. Now, of course, to do that, you have to have a product, I think, that you can distribute massively. So in the sense, I agree with Tanguy that it doesn't come from the regulation. You first have to have something that, so I think that's one of the good things about software, is that it does scale massively. Now, of course, there's a lot of friction. In our case, people have no clue what carbon accounting is in most cases. So we have to essentially evangelize. But really, what we're trying to do here is a fully self-service carbon accounting system. There are millions of people using financial accounting, small business owners that had strictly no training in this field and are essentially able to onboard themselves once they start a business. So I think when it comes to carbon accounting, and then as a next step, of course, how you reduce your emission, it needs to flow by itself. So it's a product thing. We're pretty focused on finding the right distribution, channels. So of course we do this directly, but we see a number of highways to do this, right? So banks are one. They're starting to, in the same way that they offered pre-accounting services as part of their user experience, for small business owners. I think, I know they'll start doing it for carbon accounting. And one of the reasons is that they have themselves the obligation to measure their own footprint, and as part of this, for which they are responsible at their customers. So highways, distribution. So investment funds are one. As you know, one of the greatest risks to financial stability is climate change. So you have somebody called Mark Carney, right, who imposed carbon accounting across the board for financial institutions. So he's forcing every investor to track their carbon emissions. So I think it's a product and it is a regulation, but the regulation can't be too early if there isn't basically a tool to make it happen. And really, I think at the end of the day, that's what innovation is. So scaling, it's the adoption of new technologies. And so the regulation essentially comes to sanction what the market has already started adopting. So, you know, we're working to make it happen until basically people understand that it's cheaper to do carbon accounting than financial accounting. And once that message gets across, there won't be any reason not to basically impose it on everybody. And when I mean everybody, I really mean everybody. So, you know, every individual, every SME, every big group. So
every regions.
Yeah.
Great. So we've heard two ways on how to scale this impact. The one is going global from the first day on and trying to impose or to bring a product which scale fast globally. And then you mentioned it, Alexis, the reliance on distribution partners that helps you scale this product. What are our entrepreneurs think about this? Do you have a difference of assessing, or do you think there is a difference of assessment between impact startups and non-impact startups, or that should just be the same type of criteria when it comes to scale?
I think you said entrepreneurs, but I think you were addressing the question to
investors.
Yeah. So impact versus non-impact startups. I think, I mean, the thesis of our fund is that large problems are large markets, and large markets are usually interesting investment opportunities. However, there are, I think also it's important to acknowledge that there are a number of very important problems which potentially deeply affect smaller numbers of people or have a somewhat smaller scope or scale that also deserve to be solved. And they may not always be classical venture cases. And so you hear about kind of the spectrum and impact of different kinds of impact financing, ranging from more venture philanthropy to sort of impact-focused venture capital. And I think it's really important that we have the spectrum, because it is important that problems that deeply affect smaller numbers of people also are addressed. But just as not all business models are necessarily good venture cases, the same is true in impact business models. So we look at a sort of specific subsection, and we see that this is an ever-growing space with more and more great entrepreneurs wanting to tackle these large problems, and with more and more opportunities to create scalable solutions. But of course, there's a whole bucket of problems where venture may not be the right model. And these are important impact cases, and where there are a number of other financing partners who are better suited, and where we think this is equally as important is just outside of at least Revent's scope.
Mm-hmm. And Marie, I remember we had this topic our discussion a couple of months ago. Do you actually consider impact smaller markets which target a smaller audience? How do you feel about this?
Yeah, like it could be appealing to say that like an impact startup scale the same way as a non-impact startup, but I'm not sure that's quite true. At Investir Plus, we have a return on investment rate that we promise to our investors that are a little bit lower than classic VC, but we think that it is important to have the ability to go on smaller markets, or not even smaller markets, but maybe things that take a little bit more time than in the classic venture. Like, for instance, we have invested in a company that create applications to people with autism. So that's not a huge market, meaning that, of course, everybody hasn't autism, but still it's a big problem, because we have to integrate these people in our society. And so we have decided to go, even if it won't be a huge startup with millions and millions of turnover, but still for us, it was important to do so. So that's the first thing. Sometimes like the return on investment, financially speaking, is not as big as a classic venture can promise. So that's the first thing. And the second one is, for instance, you don't scale the same way. It's not always true, but you don't scale the same way when you're an impact company and when you're not in an impact company. One example of that is a company that is called Yuka that we have decided to invest in 2018. So it's an application that enables you to scan the barcode of your food or cosmetic product, and that gives you the impact on your health. So there are like more than 20 million users across Europe of this application. But and so there's a massive usage, but they don't monetize data or whatever. So financially speaking, it's a small project, but still it has a huge impact. They have decided not to monetize anything because the trust they can create with the users is the most important thing for us. That's the value of the company. And so they have a good product with a superb UX, but and that it's they have a massive scaling in Europe, across Europe. But it's not the same definition of scaling than a non-impact company, because you have a scales in terms of usage, but the turnover is very small, and that's a decision of the founders not to scale like other company and not to monetize anything. And our purpose and our role as an impact fund is to support that kind of entrepreneurs too. And so I guess there are some difference between impact venture and non-impact venture. But for us, both are success, both can be like a definition of the success. It's not just the same thing that we are going to look.
I would tend to disagree very strongly with you, Marie. That impact startups shouldn't be held against different standards, simply because I think this question of at least maybe not for healthcare or in the particular example of Yuka, but when it comes to the ecological transition, it has to scale across the board. So if you don't have any business incentive to do so, it's an NGO thing. It's not going to work. So it needs, I think, it might be a bit bold to say, but this notion of basically, factoring in, okay, profit, people, planet is really something that I think will scale across the board. So you can't have lesser standards in terms of profit if you want this to really scale. So of course, you have to look at the particular cases, but in my personal experience, I haven't seen really any investor look at us with different criteria. So maybe I haven't been talking to the right guys, but I'm not thinking that we should be less profitable. Quite the contrary.
Maybe as Laurent said, there are different type of investors for different asset class, and I kind of agree on the health tech topic that for smaller markets, for example, autism, might not be a VC case because the market might be quite small, but it still need to be solved. Laurent, yes. You have also a point.
Yeah, I think what I just wanted to say was, I do believe that there is a role for different financial partners for different markets. And I also think, however, it's important that kind of the general mindset is not that impact must be with lower returns. Because I think historically that has been the lens that many have taken, and that's made impact, first of all, seem like a concession to many investors and to many founders. It's made it seem like it's its own separate category where expectations should somehow be somewhat lower. And I think it's also potentially dissuaded some people from actually wanting to go in the direction of impact, because they thought, okay, I could either start an e-commerce business and make a lot of money and get a lot of fame and, build this huge company, or maybe I can do the little brother, which is an impact company. And I think what's happening now is that you see in many cases, this mindset is changing, and people see impact as really this very interesting commercial opportunity as well, precisely because these are in many cases the most pressing problems And I do think it's important that we don't always associate impact with lesser financial return, because sort of in terms of this larger systemic change that we need to make, this shift towards thinking about people, planet, profit, purpose all together, it's important that they're not viewed as being necessarily at odds. And I think this can be true while also acknowledging, again, that there are cases and there are instances where it's very important that there are different financial partners who will support businesses, ideas, projects, initiatives that aren't necessarily traditional venture cases. And I think both of these things can coexist, and I think that they do coexist.
Yes, of course. And like in our case, we have like some startups that generate a lot of profit, and so they contribute very positively to the return on investment of our portfolio. And on the other side, we have like more niche products and markets that are very important to address, because otherwise, if we just look at big markets, there are some problems that we cannot solve. So that's very important to us to have the ability also to look for and support companies that have a little maybe lower potential in terms of in financial terms, but still have a potential to scale, to be used, to have strong usage across the world. And that doesn't mean that this company won't be profitable. They are, but they are still maybe have lower range of profits than other companies that VC used to look. And that's important, I guess, that as Lauren says, that there are some investors that also look for these kind of projects, and with that you can address like all the needs, all the markets that do exist. So it's also a kind of way to diversify your portfolio and going through different impact, and so different also potential of returns.
Great.
I just would like to add that the type of venture or investor that you may have in a company will vary over time. As the pre-seed and the seed investors that we had at Metron do not have the same profile as the people we have now, and the expectations of the people are different. So starting a company is a long-term business. It will take years, and it will need passion to come to a success. And the partners who will need, the financial partners who will need at different stages of the development of the company will be different. So I wouldn't say there is one investor for one type of company. I would add, depending on the maturity level of that company and the impact that the company has already or will develop in the coming months or years, will affect or will change the profile of the investors, definitely.
Mm-hmm.
And I really hope that in the long run, we wouldn't dissociate impact versus non-impact startups, but impact gets also embedded into the business model of the company. That would be impact at core, that we realize that not only the business acumen is here, but there is profit, there is a sustainable way of making a product and financially driven, but also that there is an impact acumen or impact basis in the company as well. Moving on a little bit beyond Europe, do you think we as Europeans have a better sense of impact, or are better suited for impact startups and scaling these impact startups into European champion that could be in the US or in Asia? I mean, maybe Tanguy, you want to start with this question since you are the most international, and then I bring also the American perspective with Lauren. So this is a great panel. We have every corner of the world represented.
Does Europe have a competitive advantage? Yes and no. The fact that in Europe everything is so complex makes it much, how would I say, much more complex for the companies to develop. But once we have developed a solution that works in Europe, usually we're able to go much faster on the other continents. If you just think about languages, it's obvious that an app in Europe has to be multi-languages. Going from Portugal up to Sweden means you change almost 10 times from languages and regulation and everything like that. If you go to the US, the market is much easier to access. So being in a harsh environment might be seen as an advantage. When you're an entrepreneur, you have to consider that as an advantage, I think. another thing that helped us at Metron to get a global visibility was the label of the French Tech, because I mean, when Metron was started at the very early stage, we have got investors coming from South Korea and Japan. For a French company with less than, at that time, 100 people, it was impressive for us to have such a commitment, let's say, from those investors. So today you could say, okay, we are 200 people, we have a subsidiary in 10 different countries, and we are growing very fast, and we're still hiring a lot of people. But that visibility was for us a key thing. And in that case, having French Tech or different labels like the Solar Impulse Foundation and so on has helped us to get visibility and credibility across the world. That remains an important way for us to attract people, both employees and investors in the company.
Yeah, great. That's what we aim at La French Tech Munich, to bring this bridge between France and Germany a bit smoother for go-to-market. Lauren, what's your perspective on US versus Europe impact?
Yeah. I mean, I think I'd start by saying this is a great time for tech in Europe in general. And there's a reason that I, as an American, am in Europe and not in the US, am investing in tech, because I think there is a little bit of almost catch up that Europe is doing. But that means that this is a really exciting time with lots of great new companies, with really kind of healthy dynamics, with now more and more capital in the market here. So that's kind of the first statement. I think the second statement is that in terms of impact in particular, I would say, this is now a huge generalization, so forgive me, but I would say in general, the European mindset, to the extent that we can say there is such thing as a European mindset, is one that takes climate somewhat more seriously on average, and that has somewhat more of the sense of social responsibility. I mean, you see this in the way that the states are structured, right? With the US, with its hyper-capitalism and with a very slim safety net, and then your average European country, which has a much more robust safety net. So there's more of this mindset, I think, in Europe of responsibility, of paying attention to climate, of taking these large problems very seriously. And of course, this doesn't mean that there aren't pockets in the US that see this in the same way. But on average in Europe, I think that's more the case. And I think what that means, maybe the third point I would say, is that because of the social safety net in Europe, I think there was a long period of time when perhaps there wasn't as much innovation in education, in health tech, digital health, a number of topics where actually in Europe, the state has really stepped in. And that meant for a long time, I think the idea was, okay, the state takes care of this, so tech focuses on all of these other topics. And I think in particular through COVID, actually, there's been something of an awakening of the ways in which the state can't always solve problems, and the need for innovation and for thinking in different ways about healthcare, the delivery of health, about education, empowerment, fintech, a number of topics which in Europe used to be left to the state. I think this is now something of an awakening where people say, okay, actually what we really need is exactly tech and innovation in these areas. So you see now this wave of companies, certainly in climate, that's been happening even longer, but also now in digital health, in education, upskilling, et cetera, emerging in Europe, which I think makes this a really fruitful, ripe, kind of great environment to be investing in these topics in Europe. Whereas in the US, there were always huge gaps left by the state and always kind of specific tech solutions, but often priced in a way that exacerbated this divide and not necessarily made for the masses. So I think in general, for these types of topics, it's kind of a great time to be investing in Europe.
And Lauren, if I may add a personal anecdote, speaking to a couple of VCs that branded themselves as, climate change focused. I had one conversation with a VC in Berlin who, asked me to talk to a person on his staff who was a PhD on carbon accounting, and he was like extremely expert, and he talked about databases and stuff that I thought only my data science team knew about, and so on. And I was super impressed. And then I had the same conversation with a VC in the US, exactly the same branding and so on. And he's like, oh, okay, I don't see the point of carbon accounting. What's next? Where's the money? And then I said, but I thought you were looking at sustainability. And he basically says, yeah, sure, we've invested in SpaceX. And so I was like, flabbergasted at the cultural differences. So maybe it's just an anecdote, but there's a maturity on the topic that will not last very long in Europe. That, I mean, we are ahead, but I don't think it would last very long.
Yeah.
So,
do you see a difference between France and Germany? We know Germany has been very keen on impact.
so I don't see much a difference, except the French love nuclear energy, which is, of course, a great way to lower carbon emissions. So,
an approach on energy policy. Marie, your point of view?
Yeah, indeed, we have like a startup that is at the moment, a French startup that at the moment scaling in Germany. I don't see a lot of difference in how the market is built and stuff like that. Like, but the first thing is that, like, if we have to talk about France, it is a very different and complex environment, especially because the regulation is very different from, even in Europe, there's no one European market. It's very different. So, and in the impact field, we have a lot of companies that are working for the general interest. So these are topics that in France are much regulated. So one advice I give to these startups that want to go across the borders is to see like how different is the market regulated in other countries and stuff like that. So maybe that's the first thing to do to go abroad, and even like across the border, Germany and France are very nearby, but we see a lot of difference on how the health is financed or stuff like that. So that maybe it's the most important thing to look at.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, let's actually focus a little bit on go-to-market strategies and what you would advise a founder and entrepreneur to do if they want to scale an impact company. So what is the kind of do's and don'ts, or what would be your best advice if you had an entrepreneur who wants to go from France to Germany, from Germany to France, but also international outside of Europe? What are the things that they should pay attention to as impact companies?
Yes, I guess you have to look at the regulation and legislation and how it is different from France. So that's the first thing. But then I guess scaling in an impact business is quite the same thing as scaling a classic business across Europe. Maybe the most important is to like have a good understanding of the ecosystem, and including the impact ecosystem, to have strong business and impact allies in the company you go in. So for instance, like that company that is called WeFight that is scaling into Germany, like they have contacted a lot of incubators, support programs in Germany. I guess I have to tell them to also contact the French Tech Munich, of course, but they're like having like strong realize that have a legitimacy and a good understanding of the local market. I guess it's very important, and maybe it's even more important for companies that are in the impact field and like make change for the general interest. So that are subjects that are very close to the governments and stuff. So it's not the same thing as scaling like a SaaS company that is working with multinational big companies across the world, and that already have that very international mindset, versus having like a product that is very dedicated to local market and change stuff in the way health is done in a very specific field. So it's very important to have a good understanding of the market, I guess.
Lorraine, what would be your advice to an entrepreneur who is looking to internationalize?
I mean, the advice would be, I think, pretty similar, independent of the focus of the company, right? Which is to focus on what is the value that your product is delivering to whom, how is it differentiated, how is it, to what extent is it defensible, how can you use your brand, your purpose to really leverage your expansion, and of course, hiring. I mean, the key to early stage companies is really finding, attracting, and retaining the best talent. And this is very much true when you're scaling, trying to find kind of the best people who understand the dynamics of the country to which you're expanding, who can really lead this for you. And this is true independent of kind of the focus of your company.
So Tanguy, Alexis, how did you solve this problem of talent recruiting when you internationalized?
Well, I think we haven't completely solved it. We're working on it. We're in I mean, the positive thing is once you raise a bit of capital and given our purpose, I think people coming onto the job market today are extremely interested in purpose-driven companies. So it's easier to recruit than if we were doing expense claim management or something boring. But the thing is, so we find people coming, and actually, at least in France, there's no shortage of good engineers willing to look at these topics, good and cheap, which is really a competitive advantage, I think. But now, it's more about scaling, becoming our own recruitment agency, training people. We're in a domain where expertise is extremely valuable to customers, because most of the people we're talking to have really actually rather little knowledge on the topic. So our sales guy is really almost a counselor to the customer and getting him on board the whole climate change journey. And this expertise, there actually has been strictly no training anywhere in the world on climate change in the last 50 years. So basically, pretty much every climate expert is a self-taught. So it's really our job to create these training programs so that people quickly know, in our specific case, what carbon accounting is, how to explain it in simple words, and et cetera, et cetera. So that's the fun of we're experiencing in building a good sales machine, I think. So.
But a great idea for a master in climate change. I'll bring this.
Well, I mean, it's starting, right? But it's only starting now, whereas we've known about this stuff for 50 years. So.
Tanguy, any thoughts?
I would summarize the approach that we have at Metron with one word, which is diversity. We have thought from the very beginning that if we want to be successful both in Japan and in Mexico, we need different people. Alexis just mentioned the example of perception of what is climate change and what is impact both in the US and in Europe. If you look at the different countries, the different cultures, the different people, the different backgrounds that those people have, that's only the diversity that will bring a real capital to the company. I am not talking about investment. I am not talking about money. I am talking about knowledge, culture, vision, ambition. That has to be shared, and that has to be shared with people coming from different origins, different backgrounds, different skins, colors, different religions. It doesn't matter. We need engineers, but we also need people in the human resource management. We need people in the marketing. We need a lot of people. Today we have about 200 people. We do have more than 40 open positions in the world, and we expect to be more than 300 by the end of next year. So yes, there is an open place and an open space for diversity. We badly need that in our companies, and that's, I think, one of the key factors to be successful on a global scale.
Perfect. I think this is a great word for the end of our panel, diversity. We're just right on time, so I would like to thank Marie, Lauren, Tanguy, and Alexis for joining me on this panel for the Respond Days in cooperation with La French Tech Munich. It was very insightful. I can't thank you too much for all the great thoughts and great minds that we had around the table today about scaling impact at European level. Of course, La French Tech Munich is here to cooperate with startups that would like to cross the Rhine between France and Germany. So don't hesitate to come to us if you would like to have, or if you have an expansion project between the two countries. I wish all of you guys successful and impactful journey at Revent, at Investir Plus, at Metron, and at Greenly. And thanks a lot for joining. It was very, very interesting discussion.
Thank you.
Many thanks.
Thank you, Sabine.
Hope to talk to you guys soon then.
Yes.
Sounds
If
good.
you're planning to Germany, come to us.
All right.
Yeah, we
You.
will. Thanks.
All the best.
Bye
Thanks a
now.
lot.
Bye bye.
Bye. Ciao.
Bye.
Bye.